Welcome to the For Everyday Disciples podcast, where we share the good news of how much God loves us, how we respond in love to Him, and how we reflect His love to our neighbors.
Hi, friends, and welcome to the For Everyday Disciples podcast by Wayfinders. I'm Giles.
And I'm Alison.
Alison, I have realized that I really hate to do something, and what I really hate to do is listen to myself after the podcast.
What's that mean?
Usually I just get in there and edit our podcast and get it ready to post. But sometimes I listen through it or you play it for me afterwards. And I've come to a realization. As soon as I remove one crutch word, I like to put another one in there. So last time I was listening to it, I don't even know how many times I said in regards to, but first of all, I'm going to try to eliminate that from the podcast. Second, it's things, when you try to remove that word like, you tend to put in some other words as you are growing. And so I've determined that before we make it to the national stage for this podcast, because we're currently pretty limited, I want to make sure to keep trying to eliminate those filler words from my speech. It is difficult to do, though.
It's so hard to do. And it's, that's an exercise that...
You just said
that's I have a lot of crutches. But that's an exercise, that people... I just said it. People are asked to do is listen back to yourself recorded. And that's how you remove those, like you said, crutches, and because you don't realize you're doing it when you're doing it, right? So
it's a pretty humbling experience to hear yourself in that way. It is one of the most humbling experiences for the podcast. You have a few things going on. One is obviously those filler words. Two, listening to yourself.
Yes.
Your recorded self, which always sounds different than how you sound in your head.
Right.
And I feel that we're much more critical of ourselves than typically other people would be of our voices because they're used to hearing it. But when we hear ourselves, I thought I sounded like James Earl Jones and I sound like Pee Wee Herman.
That's hilarious. Okay. Well, hopefully y'all are offering us grace in how we're saying it or not saying it, and I'm sorry if there's a distraction there with some phrases that we're saying that are crutch words, but
we certainly pick it up in other people's podcasts now. And it is, once you concentrate on that word, you can't help yourself.
You can't help it. I
just
know.
Being totally preoccupied by it.
It's so true. It's so true. Well, we're happy you're with us. We're going to continue our discussion today on the Enneagram with type 9, and which is the peacemaker or the peaceful person. And I've mentioned this before on the podcast that I am a type 9. So this episode hits close to home for me, maybe in a good way, an insightful way, but also a little bit of conviction, I think, probably too.
She is a type 9, folks. She is a type 9. I've actually considered this quite a bit in learning what motivates you as a type 9.
Yeah.
So when you study the Enneagram or when you're going through the Enneagram, typically if you know people that are close to you that are certain types, you will study them quite a bit more. So I've spent a bit of time looking at type 9s just so I could understand my wife a little bit better.
Yeah.
And so when you think about your 9-ness, what would be some characteristics that jump out at you that perhaps you may battle?
Yes. So what immediately came to my mind is harmony. And both in my inner world and my outer world, I desire that harmony. I don't like conflict of any sort, so I tend to avoid it at all costs. I have that avoidance response. And oftentimes that shows up for me in kind of a go along to get along attitude in relationships. Don't rock the boat, just kind of be quiet, go along with it, even if it's not something I want. And I think along with that, desire for harmony is this temptation to disengage. And because again, I don't want to disrupt what I think is peace, right? We're going to talk about it's not really, but so that disengagement is especially true with my emotions. I often don't want to deal with strong emotions like sadness or anger. And so I find ways to check out or distract myself so I can avoid that internal disharmony. And that sense of disengagement also shows up outwardly in indecision, in perhaps complacency, perhaps in a lack of confidence or thinking that my voice or opinion don't matter. And we'll talk about that as we go along today.
9s are really strong in empathy. And because of that, and I've certainly seen this with you, because of that, they internalize a great deal of emotions. Yes. But as you said, sometimes how to get those emotions appropriately out or what to do with them can be a bit of a difficulty. And Allison's actually been going through a little bit of a season herself in this, just some things that God has been putting upon her heart and that she's been learning about have really caused a great deal of strong emotions, I know, within her. And she's trying to navigate that right now. What do you do with all of these emotions, right? And you mentioned, because of that 9ness, one of the things that you do is you can go along to get along, but that doesn't necessarily handle all those strong emotions.
Yeah.
Because that could actually lead to peacekeeping and not peacemaking, which are different. So can you explain to us the difference between those two things? Because I think even internally, when you try to just do peacekeeping internally, it doesn't really work for you, even in your relationship with Christ and abiding with him.
Right. Yeah. I think, when I really started looking at this, and we have a tool we'll talk about in a second, but before I really thought about it, for most of my life, I think I didn't even make that distinction between peacekeeping and peacemaking. I probably just called it, I'm a peacemaker, but really I was keeping the peace. And when we keep peace instead of make peace, it's actually counterproductive to the sense of harmony because it leads to more disharmony and disconnection in relationships in the long run. In the short run, you don't have the conflict, but over time it erodes the relationship because the conflict doesn't go away, right? It just sort of sits on the back burner.
What we were just talking about. I mean, it really is internalized.
Yeah. And like you say about me, Giles, I'm a slow burn. If, I'll think things are okay and I'm just like, it's all right. That comment didn't really hurt me, or, it's fine that person feels that way. But then later, if like maybe a day later, I get really fired up, because I haven't really dealt with it immediately. And so then, that leads to like, I don't want to confront the person, or I don't want to deal with the situation. So it just could continue to fester, which then can lead to resentment and bitterness. It might also come out in a passive aggressive way through comments to other people, or just other unhealthy ways, just being irritable. That happens to me a lot when I don't deal with emotion, or when I sense some conflict or disagreement, but I don't actually address that with the person. That can come out for me in like irritability, general irritability.
Before you get to peacemaking, though, I do want to say that this isn't just in relationships necessarily with a person. That can be an outcome of it. But this is even in relationship to, we read a lot of books, right? So we're learning all the time. This is in relationship to, we'll talk about it probably a little bit later in this podcast, but about the 9 sense of justice as well, because you can read things that really begin creating those emotions for you against other people. Yeah. Even though you may not be in a personal relationship with them, it is that sense of justice can, if we're not careful and we're trying to just keep the peace even internally, can lead to that bitterness or resentment, as you said, which I know is very hard for you to sometimes navigate, because that line of justice to vengeance or resentment can be a pretty fine line.
Yeah. So instead of dealing with it, however that looks, whether turning that over to God in prayer, journaling, I do that a lot, but if I'm just trying to shuffle it under the rug and not deal with it at all, then you're right. That retreat really, breaks that connection and harmony that I'm ultimately seeking, that's motivating me. So it is really counterproductive to my motivation, right?
It's just something to be aware of if you are 9, because I've certainly seen it with Allison, and I consider her extremely healthy in regards to, even if I would look at the Enneagram and stuff like that, but I do see those kind of spikes sometimes.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is because she's trying to navigate something internally, which a lot of times she may just need to release or trust God with, or abide with God in it, instead of trying to control that whole situation.
Yeah, and that's a good point of learning for yourself. If you're a 9, if you're relating to this as we go along, learning for yourself, like, what are those warning signs? We talk a lot of times about, like, that dashboard light that comes on your car, that says, like, oh, I need an oil change, or I got a flat tire. What's that warning sign for you that I'm not dealing with something? I'm burying something. I'm numbing something. I'm distracting myself, and we all have different ways that comes out, right? So maybe paying attention to that in your own life and my life, of what is that warning sign that I'm really not dealing with something that I needed to spend time on.
So we've been talking about peacemaking.
Yeah.
And sort of the pitfalls, I would say, internally and externally with it. But you would share that there's another way that we can go about this, which is called peacekeeping. Can you share a little bit about that?
You said that backwards. We've been talking about peacekeeping.
That's right. I did say it backwards.
See, it's hard.
But you know what's interesting? I didn't use a filler word, though. I don't think. So,
so you listen
at least I said it clearly, just the wrong direction. So let me rephrase that. We have been talking about peacekeeping and sort of the pitfalls of that, especially for a 9, either externally or internally. But you would share that there is another type called peacemaking. Can you share a little bit more about peacemaking and what that is?
Yes. So peacemaking is being willing to actually talk about the problem in a productive way that honors the other person and leads to deeper connection and understanding. So instead of running away from conflict, we're leaning into it because we value the relationship. And so resolving conflict, actually, if we do it in a healthy way, it actually strengthens our relationships with each other, because, a lot of times conflict arises because, at least for me, I can think just in my own experience, that I haven't communicated something, whether it's an expectation or, I'm observing something about the other person and I'm kind of making up this story in my head, right? I have this narrative going that's really an assumption that I'm making. So a lot of times conflict arises because we don't have clear communication. So if I just continue to go down that route in my mind and not clarify with the other person, that's going to hurt the relationship, because I'm making a lot of assumptions about what that person said, how they're behaving, how they're not behaving. Maybe they're not even reaching out to me and I'm like, what's going on? Do they even care about me? I'm making up a lot of stories in my head. So if I actually lean into that and have open those lines of communication with that person, that actually strengthens the relationship either way, because it could be, it's checking that assumption. My assumption could be correct. And then, it's, well, what's going on here? Like, why are you avoiding me? Like, I feel like you're avoiding me. Like, do we need to talk about something in our relationship? Or my assumption could be completely incorrect, and then I'm allowing the person to correct it and tell me what's really going on with them, So either way, it's deepening the relationship. Whereas if I'm avoiding that conflict because I don't want to deal with it, right? I don't want to be rejected. I don't want to feel anything negative, then that actually disintegrates relationship over time, because what is retreat but pulling away? I'm pulling away from that person. I'm pulling away maybe from my own emotions. And so I'm not being real. I'm not being seen. I'm not being known. So.
and from my own personal experience, and I'm sure you've experienced this as well, if I am in relationships with people and I am feeling this kind of tension or feeling this kind of potential resentment or feeling this frustration. I like to use the word frustration because I think a lot of times we may not move totally to resentment, but we may have a frustration.
Right.
I feel that it also then somehow, right, transfers itself to my relationship with God. So it's something to be very concerned about, is that our relationships are not just between us and other people. All of those relationships also have a component of our relationship with God, and sort of things flow out of that. So either one way or the other, if I'm angry at God, I'm probably going to have a anger towards other people. If I'm frustrated or disappointed or resentful of other people, that's also going to project up towards God. And I think even when we talk about communion or common union, it does sort of lead to this component of you need to go and seek that forgiveness in a relationship before you come into union with God, because he knows that there's sort of a tainted process that goes through there. So as disciples, right? So we come at this podcast as disciples of Jesus. So as disciples, we're called not to keep the peace, but we're called to make peace.
Yes.
Just like Jesus did. He didn't avoid conflict. He addressed it head on with the intention to bring shalom. And shalom is that state of peace, right? It's almost like a posture of peace, true peace to the situation. We're called to righteousness or right relationship with God, with others, and with creation. So addressing and resolving conflict is a big part of the reconciliation process for us, right, with others, but also in our reconciliation or our redemptive process with God.
Yeah, so true. And, we didn't want to go into too much detail on this episode because we want to get to other things about type 9, but we teach a tool in Kaleo disciple training that's called the PAUSE tool, and that PAUSE is an acronym. It's a practical way for us to stop, reflect, and engage with peacemaking rather than retreating into avoidance. And so we're going to drop that in the notes for this episode. We have a teaching video that actually teaches the tool. So if you're like me and you struggle with entering into conflict or you want to avoid conflict, and maybe that's your default position, I think this tool will be really helpful to you because it's practical. It's practical ways to go about it when you sense a conflict in a relationship. And it's a very loving way to do it that affirms the relationship. It seeks to understand the other person's perspective, just what we were talking about with assumptions or expectations. So it's a very loving way to resolve conflict. I think honestly, it plays into a 9's strengths of being a good listener and empathetic and all those things. So.
It does. And it really plays into a 9's potential weaknesses, as in 9's desire to be prepared. So it has a portion, which is preparation. And they also have a tendency to not want to sometimes escape the conversation. But this one at the end has a forced return back to evaluate. So the pause tool is a great tool for anyone, but it is especially great for someone that may be a bit conflict avoidant. So it really works well for them. So we want to talk a little bit about the temptations and struggles of a type 9, but before we do that, let's talk about the strengths that flow from being that peaceful presence. When 9's are emotionally and spiritually healthy, they reflect unique aspects of God's character, his peace, his patience, and his reconciling love. A great example that we can see in Scripture is Barnabas, who encouraged and unified the early church. And you can read more about that in Acts 11, 22 through 24.
Yeah, Barnabas was known as the son of encouragement, right? That's kind of the label we give him, because he brought comfort and peace wherever he went. He wasn't flashy or forceful. He was steady and dependable, someone others could count on. And I'm guessing that Barnabas was that calming presence. So someone who fostered reconciliation and healing in the midst of tensions.
And like last week, I shared that when we share these examples of the behaviors of an Enneagram type, we are not necessarily saying that these individuals in scriptures are this specific Enneagram.
Right.
Because
just characteristics.
But it's characteristics, and we're giving you references from scripture where you can see, oh, well, this person was sort of being a healthy version of this or an unhealthy version of this.
Yeah.
So I wanted to clarify that again as I share this next example, because I actually think we may have shared Abraham as an 8 as well. So I want to make sure that we're understanding that part, because here's an example of Abraham, a 9 characteristic. In Genesis 13:8-9, when there was a conflict between his and Lot's herders, Abraham didn't fight for his own way. So instead, he chose the path of humility and offered Lot the first choice of the land. That's the wisdom of Romans 12:18. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone.
Healthy 9s create safe spaces for other people. We're empathetic listeners and mediators who promote connection. This just happened to me yesterday. I was in a conversation with a dear friend who's a kindred spirit with me. And, she was sharing a deep struggle that she goes through in her life, has been going through. And, she said that to me. She said, I'm so grateful I can share this with you because I don't feel shame sharing this, and so I think 9s, when we're healthy, we can be those empathetic listeners who do create a safe space where people can share. But when we're unhealthy, that pursuit of peace, the desire for harmony, like I'd said, can turn into complacency, indecision, and withdrawing emotionally.
And it can be hard to see sometimes. I'll just speak from my relationship with Allison, because there can be a quietness to either side of those.
That's true. Yeah.
So and 9s can have a tendency to be the kind of person that's willing to be in a spot and not necessarily need to be heard. Mm-hmm. But it's not like they don't have a desire to be heard.
Yeah.
But sometimes it can be hard to discern what exactly is happening. So it is something to be aware of when you are engaging with 9s, is as the non-9, to provide a space, to make sure that you are providing space for them as well, to be able to share, to be able to speak, to be able to be engaged in that process, because you can sometimes close them out and you may not even realize you're doing it, because it can be a tendency of the healthy side as well.
Yeah.
So healthy 9, as you said, healthy 9s create those safe spaces for others. But as I was sharing, we have to be careful, because sometimes for the 9s, the sin of sloth can come in. And we're not talking about lounging on the couch in sweatpants, binge watching a series, although it could be those things.
Yeah, that can happen too, especially with that disengagement, right? Or avoidance. But sloth, the term sloth for a type 9, is actually about avoiding the deeper work of engaging with life, emotions, and purpose. And it's passivity. I mean, that's a better word for it, maybe apathy, passivity. So it's choosing comfort over calling, because it's that withdrawal from life, essentially.
And as we've shared with with type 8, and now we're going to be sharing with type 9, the primary temptation for a 9 is that in that avoiding conflict, and that in that they will preserve their sense of worth and security. But Henry Nouwen's lie says, I am what I do, also hits here in this spot.
Yeah.
9s may believe their value comes from keeping the peace and ensuring harmony, even if it means, as I was sharing before, disappearing in the process. They can piece themselves out, like peace out, peace out of the process because of that.
Right. And it's dangerous to believe that lie, because it can lead to a pattern of emotional withdrawal and passivity. So it's almost like that autopilot. We're just going along and letting life kind of carry us along, because we're thinking, if I avoid this conversation, everything will stay calm, status quo, like I'll have that harmony. But like we've talked about repeatedly here, in reality, actually leads to deeper frustration for us and for others, because it's not true peace and it's not true harmony.
Now I'm going to put you on the spot. And of course, if I do know something about 9s, this is not something I should probably do without the time to prepare. But I do want to ask you, can you maybe share a situation or a story about when you were in maybe a tense spot or engaging with someone else that you did withdraw, you feel like maybe in an unhealthy manner, when you maybe should have engaged or become more of a peacemaker?
You did put me on the spot. Nothing's readily coming to mind.
You've worked at some pretty I remember in the past you've worked at some pretty stressful jobs, or you've certainly been in stressful relationships with people. I just was wondering if sort of how that could play out, if you could share something, a story about that, but you can't. So no, well, I'll share one then maybe for you. I guess I was the one that asked the question.
You obviously have something in mind. I'm like, nothing's coming to my mind.
Well, Allison, when she first got out of law school, she worked at a law firm, and she had a very, I would say the lawyer that she was responsible for was a pretty volatile individual and pretty abrasive.
Worked under, I guess.
Yeah,
maybe not responsible for, but
yeah, worked under.
He was my immediate supervisor, manager.
And I just remember that it was not really a spot where in her 9-ness, it would have been a very hard thing to engage actually some of those things or to speak back against it. Mm-hmm. And so it actually created a great deal of stress for her that she was carrying a lot of the time, because she didn't feel like she had a voice in that spot or that she could actually even engage in that. Mm-hmm. And so that sort of was a negative relationship, which thankfully ended at a certain point.
Right.
But one of those situations that if you are someone who is maybe a little bit more conflict avoidant, being in that kind of relationship with someone who's very strong personality, mm-hmm. who can be abrasive, can be a very difficult spot for a 9 to be in. So I don't know. Was that a situation you would say that some of your worst characteristics of 9-ness came out?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the relational aspect added to, I had a lot of stress in that time period just with the job in general. But yeah, I think definitely the stress of the relational stuff. And it did come to a little bit of a head for me with that person, because I did eventually say something, because there was some insensitivity there on that person's part. And I called him out for it, at one point, because it just got too much. It got too much for me. So yeah.
The funny part about that story too was that this was an individual that when Allison left, he was telling her how great she was and all of these incredible things. And she was like, couldn't you have told me that when I was there? But the reason I wanted to sort of talk about that a little bit, or just bring up maybe one of those situations is that it's actually, that sort of space is actually can be a bit of a control issue. Mm-hmm. And when we're talking about Thomas Keating, and I'll share with why it's a control issue. Thomas Keating talks about this as a false self-program of power and control. And for 9s, it actually manifests itself subtly. So that's why I was sharing this story, because it's actually pretty subtle. Instead of dominating others, because it was not going to be a situation in which you were going to dominate this individual.
Right.
That's not a tendency of 9. What they can do is they can try to control their environment by avoiding chaos or tension. So in a relationship like that, the way they can handle it is that I'm going to avoid them, or I'm going to close the door to my office, or I'm not going to try to engage with them at all, because this is the way that I can control maybe some peace.
Yeah, it's, again, this false sense of I have the upper hand here, when it's really eating me up from the inside, by putting off those hard conversations or resisting making decisions, suppressing emotions to maintain this illusion. It's really an illusion of calm. But in the end, it's exhausting. It's emotionally exhausting, could be physically exhausting, right? Mentally exhausting. And it cuts off meaningful connection with other people and with God, like you said, ultimately, because if I'm in that state of hiddenness or control, then I'm not surrendering to God either in that situation.
You guys should have seen the look on Allison's face when I had that question, because again, I feel like it was triggering every single part of the night of I am not prepared for this. What are you asking me? But I am glad we talked about it, because I do feel that sometimes stories are helpful in people understanding that put yourself in a story, put yourself in a situation to see how someone reacts. And I just remember how impactful that was on her, because of course in our relationship, again, right? It's not, these things don't happen in vacuums.
Right.
Some of that she was just frustrated quite a bit. Mm-hmm. And especially during that job because of that lack of harmony
Yeah.
in that space that she was working. So I do like this thing about cutting off that meaningful connection you just shared about with God and others, because of the biblical example of this is Moses. His reluctance in Exodus 4:10 through 13. So God called him to lead the Israelites, but Moses tried to avoid that responsibility.
Yeah.
And it was really that fear of inadequacy. He was really feeling like he wasn't up to the task, and he wanted to stay in a comfort zone. So like Moses, though, type 9s can have a tendency to do that, to have a fear maybe of inadequacy. So there is a fear of stepping into that action, fearing conflict, and especially fearing failure.
Yeah, another way this resistance to any discomfort shows up for 9s, and this is definitely true for me, is the false belief that my presence doesn't matter. So I may be reluctant, or even fearful is a stronger word, to voice my ideas, opinions, preferences, or needs because I want to avoid any tension or conflict. So I mistakenly believe that my role is to maintain peace for others. And ironically, as we've talked about, this reluctance really is counterproductive. It creates a deep sense of disconnection and isolation for a type 9, so that harmony we're seeking actually is elusive in that situation. So by avoiding outward tension, I'm really creating this inner tension, because I'm cutting myself off from genuine relationships, from living out of my authentic self. And within that, I'm also shrinking back from the gifts and contributions that God has appointed to me in fulfilling his calling on my life.
Before I go on, I just really do want to, even in this podcast and in this moment, really affirm you in the fact that you do have a great deal of gifts. And I feel that, as Christ says, we don't put those things under a basket. And a 9 can have a tendency to try to sort of hide even their giftedness, because a lot of times actually it's because they sort of carry a little bit of that body type sort of running into the 1s, which we'll talk about next week, that perfectionism.
Yeah.
So fear of failure is a pretty big thing. So they sometimes will not try or attempt something because they have that fear of failure, even though they could really be good at it, or they're actually even gifted in it. So it's just something that if you're a 9, to be aware of that sometimes you're going to have to step out of that comfort zone. The comfort zone being, I don't want to fail.
Yeah.
To actually find some of your greatest giftedness. And I would certainly say that is true with Alison and her art. Was it did require quite a bit of failure before you get good at it. But you sort of have to lean into that, even if it's really uncomfortable for you, even though you want to be painting Van Gogh on day 1.
Yeah.
To have to be able to say, I'm not going to be painting very well on the first day, but in the future, I know if I keep doing this, I will be able to. So in Judges 6 through 8, we see the story of Gideon. So another little 9 trait here. So when an angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon to call him to deliver Israel from the Midianite oppression, Gideon's response reflected his self-doubt and reluctance to embrace his calling. Again, this reluctance based out of, in a lot of ways, this fear of failure, or that I'm not equipped, basically saying to God, how can I do this? And then he gives his excuses. I'm the youngest in the family. I'm not.
My tribe is the least. I think he says that.
Yeah, my tribe is
of
the
Manasseh
least.
is like the least among the tribes.
He really downplays who he is, right? Even though, of course, we know that if God's asking you, he's obviously going to equip you. But in his initial reluctance to step into this leadership role, Gideon seeks multiple signs from God to confirm this message. And we even hear people all the time say, I'm putting out a fleece. I'm putting out a fleece. I actually have no problem with that. I understand why someone is saying it, but often we do, and especially, again, if you have a tendency to desire to avoid failure or conflict, you do ask for multiple signs. Well, you're going to have to show me all these different things for me to take the step, and then sometimes you never take a step at all. But God reassures Gideon in that moment that he'll be with him and that Gideon can do this. And so as we know in Scripture, Gideon does do it. But again, do we miss opportunities? And this is, of course, for 9s, but it's for any of us. do we miss opportunities to be faithful to God because we have this fear, or we're asking for all these signs, and no matter what signs we get, it's never going to be enough to counter that. What I would say is not trusting God in the situation.
Yeah, this story of Gideon is it's a powerful affirmation for anyone, but we're talking about type 9s. If you feel insignificant or incapable, because we see later in that story that as Gideon grows into his calling, he's leading this small army who defeat the Midianites. And in that, he's relying on God's guidance rather than his own strength. So it's another example showing that, my presence is significant to God. And it's not because of what I can achieve on my own, but because I'm uniquely chosen and equipped for that purpose. As you said, if God's calling me, he's going to equip me to do it. So, but no matter what I do or don't do, God sees me and loves me for who I am. I'm his beloved.
I'm his beloved. And you're going to hear that over and over and over again, because for any of the types, it is the identity that we need to be moving into is this understanding of the identity that we have been given, which is I am beloved. So for 9s, it's knowing that true peace and provision comes from this dependency on God. So trusting God, not trying to control their environment or to maintain a false sense of harmony or comfort. So courageously surrendering outcomes to God in order that they may live righteously, or as we've talked about before, in right relationship with God and others, even if discomfort is a byproduct of that surrender, especially initially.
Yeah, that's a great word. And we kind of alluded to this earlier, right, of how this affects our relationship with God. And this fear of discomfort or confrontation, and I'm saying confrontation in the way of like confronting something, that can really make us 9s passive in our faith, because this avoidance carries over to our faith, that we're avoiding the work of deeper spiritual growth because it's hard, right? We're going to have to confront and face things about ourselves, how we respond and react to the world around us, how we maybe avoid emotion, like all those things we've talked about.
That someone may not like you.
That someone may not like us, that deeper work is difficult. So that's where it's really important to intentionally practice spiritual disciplines with the help of the Holy Spirit. Obviously, it's not me producing that transformation, but just to let go and lean in to that and to the Spirit instead of choosing to disengage. So it's about growing in courage and presence as we trust God's strength and calling. And again, not me doing it on my own, but just leaning in instead of pulling away. So let's talk about that. We're going to try to do this with every Enneagram type. We did it last week with 8s. We talked about upstream and downstream practices. So let's start with those downstream practices for spiritual growth that really align with the strengths of 9s.
So I'm going to start with hospitality because I think it's a great example. Type 9s are naturally welcoming, and they love creating spaces where others feel safe and at ease. And I would say for Allison, one of the things that she really does, and she's really great at, is she loves to buy gifts for others and to be really thoughtful about it. That's a form of hospitality. And I am certainly not that type of person. So I watch her do this and I'm like, why are you thinking so much about this? Or why is this so important to you? But for her, it's a way that she shows hospitality towards others, and she's gifted at it. It's a downstream practice that she practices. So you can do hospitality, whether by inviting others into your home or simply being fully present in conversations, which she was sharing before about being a good listener. 9s, by doing this, 9s live out their desire for connection and belonging.
Another downstream practice is intercession, and that's a powerful practice for type 9s because praying for others allows us to channel our empathy into meaningful prayer rather than passive avoidance. And it's an active way to engage in the needs of others. And this has been really a helpful practice to me in my journal. I was actually sharing this with my friend yesterday because she's similarly to me. I don't know if she's a 9. She's still kind of trying to figure out her Enneagram type. But she feels things deeply on behalf of others. And I was sharing with her, I was on my prayer team at church, and this this intercession, the power of intercession came up because obviously I'm interceding in the moment on behalf of someone else at church. But then a lot of times I would take that home with me. You know, people would share some really heavy things with me, and I don't even know them, but it's hard for me to let that go. And so for me, intercession works well in my journal, that I will record and write down those prayers for other people. And then I literally write, I'm releasing this to you, God, as a way of sort of declaring, I'm not going to carry this burden. I'm not going to hold on to this. I'm going to trust you with it. So I think intercession's a powerful tool in that, especially I think a lot of 9s tend to be, because we have a high empathy level. We may tend to carry around some of that emotion of other people and not wanting to, if we don't want to deal with it and we're avoiding it, then that can be really dangerous because it's bringing down our spirit, right? So I think journaling prayers is a really great way to sort of release that burden of emotions and to also declare, I'm trusting you, God, with this person, with this situation, instead of trying to carry it myself.
9s can really be on that teeter-totter. I'm glad you shared about intercession, because I do think a couple things, right? That high empathy level, but then also that seeking justice. Intercession is powerful for 9s because, and I loved what she shared about journaling too, because I think it's very true. Because the energy that a 9 has can typically go two ways. One is it can go towards love. That the response to disharmony is love, as in, how can I move in love in this situation? And I think intercession prayer really helps with that.
Yeah.
But the other way is resentment and vengeance. And so this is the things that 9 have to be concerned about. The emotions are strong. So It's not going to be, a 9 is not going to be, even if they seem on the outside that they are lukewarm, they are not lukewarm inside.
Yeah.
They are running hot or cold. And as she said, it could be a slow burn, but it's still burning. And that's something that intercession prayer and even petitionary prayer, I'm going to throw that one in them for themselves, or lamentations, or the ability to navigate strong emotions, but then turn it back to God and say, but out of love, this is going to be my response, and not out of vengeance and not out of resentment.
Right.
So acts of service are another outflow of that. So, because again, an act of service is based out of love. You're not doing it for some other motivation. So supporting in others in quiet ways, like volunteering or helping someone, this can reflect their heart for harmony and love, and is as a downstream practice, is a really good outflow for them. Instead of, again, as she said, turning inward and then sometimes misholding the energy that they have.
Yeah, I think each of these examples of downstream practices embody several superpowers, I would say, of type 9s, which is empathy, active listening, creating safe spaces, hearing and accepting different viewpoints to bring unity among people and situations. That's being that peacemaker. And a product of being a good listener, we can find commonalities amongst people. So we can use these strengths to bring people together and to empower them to also live in right relationship with each other.
Now let's move into the upstream practices for 9s. These are the ones that challenge us to grow. Ones that immediately come to mind based on what we've talked about today is self-examination and confession. So examining self, right? Having to sit with the emotion of self,
right,
and confessing any sin moves 9 to engage with their deeper thoughts and feelings instead of just numbing out. And I'll share something here, not to embarrass her or to even be mean about it, but just sort of one of the things that I sometimes have to remind her of is to apologize. Because that can be an area that she sometimes struggles with. And her being me. Yes, and her being Allison. Because again, that rightness, it can sometimes move into this space where it's like, I don't want to admit that I'm wrong. Because again, if you think about failure, or if you think about this is reflecting on me and creating disharmony, it can be a hard thing sometimes for 9s to do. I'm not saying that I'm just saying, yes, as a 9, be aware that apology or saying you're wrong is actually a healthy practice for you. Yeah. Not because you're wrong, but because you're putting yourself in a posture of that humility and saying, I don't always have to be right. And so when 9s practice that confession with God and others, it does create that vulnerability for them. And it also creates healing, and it creates, in a unique way, a sense of releasing some of that energy that may be pent up inside of them.
Yeah. Another upstream practice is fasting. And I'm like, wow, when I read this, that really stops me in my tracks, because fasting really gets to the heart of our tendency to seek comfort through routines or other ways to distract ourselves. It could be streaming, your favorite show. It could be eating or drinking something that just brings you a sense of comfort, or numbing out. So it disrupts that tendency. Fasting disrupts that tendency. And it reminds us, as we fast from whatever it is that we might turn to for that comfort or security, it reminds us to fully rely on God for strength, for purpose, for comfort, for everything, right? So not looking to an outside source that really only brings me temporary comfort. And again, I'm not saying self-care is a bad thing, right? Self-care is a good thing if it's leading us into that deeper connection with the Lord. But it's, fasting from whatever it is, that the outside thing that I may turn to for that numbing or distraction or comfort, leads me hopefully to deeper dependency on the Lord.
And now we move to one of the really powerful upstream practices for 9s. And this is, again, the 8, 9s, and 1s, all of the body types with the I am what I do, the stillness.
Yes.
So you may be like, wow, that really sounds counterintuitive, because isn't stillness a form of withdrawal?
Yeah.
But unlike numbing out, which is a passive withdrawal, the practice of stillness is intentionally listening. So you're like leaning in and being present with God. It's engaging my heart and my mind to listen for God's voice. And you could do a simple breath prayer. We talked about those last week a bit, such as, here I am, Lord, on the inhale, and I am yours on the exhale, because those can really ground us and ground 9s in God's presence.
Yeah, I like that, making that distinction between passive and passive and active. I had to think for a second. The numbing out is withdrawing, right? But it's this passive withdrawal instead of I'm going to lean in and press in. So all of these practices we're talking about, upstream and downstream, are intended to ground us 9s in the reality that our worth isn't tied to maintaining a false peace. Instead, when we embrace the truth that we are God's beloved, we can live as reflections of God's grace, freed to love ourselves, others, God, with purpose and presence.
When type 9s embrace their God-given presence and voice, they become courageous reconcilers, compassionate listeners, and instruments of peace. So instead of avoiding that discomfort, they step courageously into their calling with purpose and confidence.
A key verse for me to remind myself of these truths is Ephesians 2:10, and I'm going to paraphrase it here in a way that I can remember it. For I am God's masterpiece, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for me to do.
And as we shared earlier, as a 9, as in any of the types, you are beloved for who you are.
Yes. Yeah, and we're not alone in this, right? God's peace is not passive. It's active, restorative, and steadfast. Jesus invites us in Matthew 11:28, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. So it's, again, that dependency on the Lord and Holy Spirit who lives within us to provide that true rest and comfort that we seek.
Alison, I've really enjoyed this podcast with you today, and especially, I know that it can be a little bit uncomfortable when we heavily engage in our Enneagram types. So mine's not for a while. Mine's like the last one, type 7.
I shared last week, like my 8 wing, right? And now we're going to talk about 1, which is my dominant wing. So like, I'm really unmasked in this.
But the good news is the pain is early on, and then it's going to be over with.
Yeah,
so then you can just slow burn the rest of the season on me being upset about, like, how dare you ask me a question that I'm not prepared for on the podcast. But I do I do think it is good to talk about these things because, you know, again, as we've shared before, these are things to be aware of. We're not saying that you're going to always have a tendency to just like always be living out of like, oh, I'm living out of the worst parts of this. But it is something to be aware of. It is something to be aware of if you are a type 9.
Yeah.
That that desire for harmony can lead to a passiveness, which can lead to actually a great deal of inner discord instead of inner harmony, which is almost like it's a working negatively against itself by what you're trying to do.
Right.
So really having that outlet, whether it is that engaging in stillness, engaging in peace making with people instead of peacekeeping, all of those things are healthy practices for a 9 to truly be utilizing their gifts and their abilities and the things that God has given them to be disciples.
Yeah, this has been a great conversation today. We hope you've enjoyed it. If any of this has resonated with you, like I said, we're dropping that resource about the pause tool in the notes that hopefully will help you not avoid conflict, but make peace. So, and if you want to learn more about how we can support you on your journey, you can visit yourwayfinders.org. And next episode, we're moving on to type 1, the perfectionist.
The perfectionist.
Yay.
And neither of us is a type 1, so we're just going to slam them. No,
hey,
but
that's my wing. So
be careful.
Don't slam me too much.
Yeah, guys, it's been a great episode today, and we look forward to being with you next time on the For Everyday Disciples podcast by Wayfinders.
See you next time.